This presentation is from the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo, the director of the Center for Future Consciousness. And the Center for Future Consciousness publishes a monthly newsletter, Future Consciousness Insights. And we also have a video school which contains videos of primarily my webinars on science fiction, but this video today will go up there as well, and there will be other videos that will go up dealing with other themes and topics connected with science fiction, the future, consciousness, etc. Here's my published books at this point in time to give you a flavor of things I've been interested in and have written about, from future consciousness, science fiction, wisdom and virtue, psychology, the future of science and technology, today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is consciousness. But I'll be bringing a number of these books that are up here right now into the presentation. The mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is to advance the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. And a key dimension to the purposeful evolution of humanity is, in fact, the purposeful evolution of consciousness. In fact, it may be the key dimension to our future purposeful evolution. Hence, in that regard, today, that's what I'm going to talk about, is the purposeful evolution of consciousness. And I have up here a quote from Julian Huxley, who I always find very fascinating quotes from. This one, which you may be familiar with: the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, an individual there in another way, but in its entirety as humanity. And that's going to be a big theme of what I talk about today, is how can we collectively evolve our consciousness. This topic, the purposeful evolution of consciousness, is an ongoing evolution in my own mind, in my own writings and presentations. Back a little over a month ago, I did a presentation on this topic at the World Future Study Federation conference in Berlin. And in conjunction with that, I've been writing a series of articles or essays on this topic in my publication, Future Consciousness Insights. This coming month, I have an essay appearing in the World Future Studies Federation magazine, Human Futures, on the purposeful evolution of consciousness. It'll be in there at the end of December. And this presentation that you're seeing today is going to be put up, as I mentioned, in the video school. So this is an ongoing evolution, stretching back far into my past and presumably in the future evolving into a book. The presentation I'm giving today is a further development off of the one that I gave at the WSF conference in Berlin. So an outline, a roadmap for today. To begin with, our views of the present and our solutions for tomorrow, and how consciousness and its evolution figures into how we see where we are today and where we should be heading in the future. And from that, I'm going to ask the question, why should we purposefully evolve our consciousness? And I'm going to start with looking at the concept of evolution. There's a key theme in understanding this topic is to understand how consciousness fits into the general phenomena of evolution. And then I'm going to introduce my idea of purposeful evolution and what that means, and my idea of future consciousness and how that connects with purposeful evolution. And these are building blocks toward understanding the future evolution of consciousness. And then hit the nail on the head. What would it mean, and is it feasible, practical, realistic to evolve our consciousness? And then I'm going to spend a good deal of time directly attacking the issue of what is consciousness? What is its nature? And why is it central and pivotal to our existence? Now, there's different ways to come at how we would evolve it. One way is to look at the failings and weaknesses of contemporary future consciousness and ask, well, how could we correct those? Another way would be to look at the different dimensions and capacities of consciousness and how we could evolve all of them. Another way would be to identify what we would think are the ideals we should aspire toward in the future evolution of consciousness. And finally, I'm going to look at cosmic far future possibilities on this topic as we find in science fiction. And science fiction has lots of them. So, assessments of the present and solutions for tomorrow. What we find when we look at our contemporary reality is we see a diversity of different theories of what our major challenges are today for humanity and what proposed solutions there are. But as Virginia Pastrell points out, the central question of our time is what to do about the future, and that question itself creates a deep divide, meaning we can't agree on what our contemporary reality is all about, what's wrong with it, and what we should do to fix it. And in my book, Contemporary Futurist Thought, I lay out probably 100 different approaches to the future, 100 different assessments of the present and how we should rectify, deal with the problems that we have today. And so in essence, what we find is this evolutionary and interactive landscape of different views about preferable futures in a state of cooperation, competition. That is, we are in an ongoing debate over the nature of human reality, what's right and wrong with it, and what we should do to fix it. And I have up here a link to a more recent review of contemporary theories. Contemporary Futurist Thought was written in 2006, and I have up a video that I did in 2014. So of course, our views about the future and our views about the present keep evolving. And indeed, I redid my review of those ideas back in 2014. Now, why purposefully evolve consciousness? A picture is worth 1,000 words. These images, in my mind, represent, and just as a sample, our contemporary state of human consciousness. And it seems to me, as embodied in these pictures and many, many others, one could see lots of weaknesses and failings in our awareness, our understanding of ourselves and the world and our conscious ideals. That is, we clearly look as if our consciousness needs to evolve. Indeed, I would suggest that consciousness is at the center of human reality. Consciousness is the medium through which everything meaningful is manifested, known, and understood. We make and remake the human world through conscious intention. Our theories of our problems and our solutions regarding the future are all creations of human consciousness. And the validity and the efficacy of our theories and actions depends upon the depth and wisdom of our consciousness. So, right at the center point, right at the core of our concerns over the present and our ideas over the future, we find consciousness, human consciousness. In fact, I would suggest that the problems and failings of contemporary reality, contemporary human reality, whether they be economic, political, social, environmental, technological, all reflect weaknesses and failings in human consciousness. And up here I have another favorite quote of mine from Mahai, who just recently died, a great positive psychologist. It is far easier for us to imagine ourselves living among better appliances than among better human beings. And indeed, I think that to consider how we can evolve in terms of our conscious capacities, abilities, would have an incredibly powerful effect upon all of the various challenges and problems we have today. And when I think of the purposeful evolution of consciousness, on one hand, there's a practical side to this. Given our problems, evolving our consciousness would in fact address practically a lot of those problems, if not all of them. But also, evolving our consciousness would give us something inspirational, something positive to look toward, a light out there in front of us. Because the absence of illness, if we have various social or global illnesses today, is not the same as health and vitality. And what we need is something that's not just simply going to fix what's wrong, but it's going to give us a positive image, a positive vision of a direction to take for the future that inspires us. And I think that evolving our consciousness does that, as well as address our problems. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to start with the idea of evolution, because it's actually in the title of this presentation. And it's critical in my mind to understand evolution and what it means if we're going to talk about the purposeful evolution of consciousness. And here's a quote from Carter Phipps' book on evolutionaries. How we think about evolution is foundational to the kinds, I can't see that quote, to the kinds of, to the kinds of something we hope for a collective future. It shapes our understanding of who we are today, how we got here, and what our role is in creating the world of tomorrow. Paradoxically, the debate about our origins is also a cultural referendum on our future. And I think what Carter Phipps is getting at there is that evolution provides a framework not only for understanding the past, but for understanding the future. And it's critical that we understand evolution if we're going to understand our future. And I have another quote, of course, here from Atelier de Chardonn: evolution is a light that illuminates all facts, a curve that all lines must follow. And there's 4 books up there, 4 book covers up there, that I derive a lot of what I'm going to say from, that all have to do with evolution. Epic of Evolution by Chasen, Time is Conflict by J.T. Frazier, Evolution Ain't What It Used to Be by Walter Truett Anderson, and The Cork and the Jaguar by Murray Gell-Mann. And of course, there's lots of other books on evolution. Although there is some relative stability, obviously, to the universe. The universe is evolutionary, and all levels of reality from the subatomic to the galactic are evolutionary realities. They are realities that have emerged through a process of transformation, and it is a mistake to view reality in its totality or at any level as static. We do not live in a static universe. We live in an evolutionary, dynamic, transformative universe. And in fact, evolution has turned out to be in the 20th century the basic dynamical principle of the cosmos. It's a framework for understanding time, past, present, and future. I should just mention as a little insert here that Leslie in our conversation before the presentation started mentioned that he was attending a webinar on the new cosmology. Well, I would suggest that our fundamental cosmology, which has emerged within science and also emerged in philosophy, is that evolution is the fundamental principle by means of which the universe self-organizes, the organization of the universe itself. And this is something that's been revealed through all of the various areas of science and history, et cetera, et cetera. The earth, life, and humanity are embedded within an evolutionary reality, and there is no such thing as a stable, harmonious nature, earth, or humanity. When we talk about natural harmony is always simply short term. Nature on the earth is perpetually in change. Gaia is evolving. Gaia is not stable. There is no stable nature. There's no stable earth and there's no stable humanity. It's all evolutionary, transformative. History reveals that. And humans are evolutionary beings across all spheres of our existence, from the psychological, social, technological, and biological. And humanity has an evolutionary past, and we have a potential evolutionary future. But at this point, I will throw in a first evolutionary jump on those ideas, that evolution itself is evolving. And what that means is that the processes of transformation that we observe in evolution, those processes themselves are evolving and changing. And there have been epochs of evolution. That is, evolution has gone through a series of stages, beginning with the subatomic and the cosmic, where new processes come in which facilitate evolution in ways that are new or different or novel. And up here I have a quote that I took from David Sloan Wilson, who is an evolutionary biologist. The most extraordinary fact about public awareness of evolution is not that 50% don't believe in it, but nearly 100% haven't connected it with anything of importance in their own lives. Now, if evolution is the fundamental principle of nature, it seems to me very bizarre that almost 100% of us don't see how this has any relevance to us. And I'll explain how it in fact does. We indeed embody, at least in terms of our understanding of the universe, and there may be lots of other things going out there that we're not aware of, a new stage in the evolution of evolution. And I have 3 books up here: The Evolution of Future Consciousness, and Evolution's Arrow, in which I delve into this idea of a new stage in the evolution of evolution. And that is because we can anticipate, because we have goal-directed guidance and creation of the future, we are able to purposively direct evolution. That is, we direct it with our conscious minds, and in particular, we can do this because we purposively guide and create changes in nature by envisioning desirable and preferable changes and purposively acting to bring about those changes. Now, people a long time ago thought that the universe, and some people still think this, the universe is being purposively guided or was purposively created. Well, what I'm suggesting here is that I don't know whether that's true. It doesn't seem to be true to me, at least, but indeed, now purpose has come into the evolution of the universe, the ongoing evolution of the universe, because we possess the capacities for anticipating, for purposively creating and guiding change through future consciousness. And purpose indeed means to direct action to achieve a future goal. We can do that because we have these conscious minds that can think and intend out ahead. So we are able to facilitate purposeful evolution because we possess future consciousness, and future consciousness involves the capacity of anticipation, involves all the theories and narratives we have about the future, involves our emotions, involves goal setting, involves motivation, planning, thinking, and purposeful action. That is all the psychological processes that the human mind has developed to deal with and approach the future. Now, our universe changes and it evolves, but now our world changes and evolves as a consequence of envisioned intended futures. This is something unique. This is not something that was happening before. So the capacity to envision the future and direct reality toward the future states was naturally selected for in us because we, in being able to learn from the past and to imagine the future, that is to transcend present reality in memory and imagination, transcend from the here and now, is a capacity that would be selected for because it gives us an advantage at surviving and thriving and flourishing over beings that weren't able to think out ahead very far, to anticipate fortune and misfortune. This is a capacity that makes perfect sense to think it would have evolved at some point or another in the evolution of life. So this evolution of this capacity is in fact what evolutionary biologist Stewart refers to as an evolution in the capacity for evolvability. That is, we have a heightened capacity for being able to evolve. We anticipate and envision and direct the future, and that's an enhancement on our very evolvability. We can evolve more efficiently and faster because of that than, say, through natural selection of genes. And this is a natural distinctive human capacity. This isn't denied that animals don't have certain levels of future consciousness, but they're nowhere near as expansive and articulate and developed as we find in humans. And this is a unique process of a ubiquitous process in evolution. That is, humans are unique in that we bring in a new level of evolution, but we fit into the big scheme of things because the big scheme of things is that through the past, there have been these repeated jumps in the capacity for evolution. So evolution has been evolving, and we're the latest instantiation of that. And that you can get a much more detailed view of if you go back and look at Eric Chasen's book, which I had up there before, on the levels of singularities in nature. Now, here we come to a key point. The argument has been presented that we should not mess with nature. We should not interfere with it. We should not play God. But the fact of the matter is, it is that very capacity that makes us human. The very thing we say we shouldn't do is what distinguishes us from the rest of nature, that we can manipulate nature and manipulate change. And in fact, this capacity is responsible for the creation and ongoing advancement of human civilization. We are where we are right now because we have purposefully evolved human civilization through future consciousness. We have evolved agriculture. We've evolved intricate social bondings. We've evolved technology. We've evolved all of the fundamental features of civilization because we can think ahead, we can plan, we can envision, and we can guide nature in ways through our own conscious minds. And that I discussed in depth in the evolution of future consciousness. We more effectively guide evolution. Now, what I would suggest as an ethics for the future, as a key center point in our future, we should develop and enhance our capacity for purposefully evolving ourselves. That is, the good future is to get better even at purposefully evolving ourselves. So to sum all this up, again from Julian Huxley, it is as if man had been suddenly appointed managing director of the biggest business of all, the business of evolution, appointed without being asked whether he wanted it and without proper warning and preparation. What is more so, he can't refuse the job. Whether he wants to or not, whether he is conscious of what he is doing or not, he is in point, in fact, determining the future direction of evolution on the earth. This is his inescapable destiny, and the sooner he realizes and starts believing in it, the better for all concerned. And what Huxley is stating there, and I think from what I said before, you could see how it would follow. What makes humans distinctive is that we guide evolution. And in order to avoid having to do that, one would have to regress to a level of biological and psychological development that was subhuman. That is to say, because we're human, we're in the business of guiding evolution, and we need to face up to it and not call it, again, somehow playing with God, or that we're not supposed to do that, because in fact, if we're human, that's what we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. So, another quote. I like quotes, obviously. The evolution of man is the evolution of consciousness, and consciousness cannot evolve unconsciously. The evolution of man is an evolution of his will, and will cannot evolve involuntarily. The evolution of man is the evolution of his power of doing, and doing cannot be the result of things which happen. George Gurdjieff. And Gurdjieff's point here is that, yes, consciousness can evolve, but if consciousness is going to evolve, that's something that we are going to consciously do. It's not simply going to happen to us, but indeed we can purposefully, intentionally, using consciousness, evolve consciousness. That is, consciousness evolving itself. Now here we have a picture of Prometheus stealing the fire from the gods. In humans, clearly we find dual motivational forces of stability and growth. That is, humans, of course, are motivated to protect and preserve what is familiar and stable. And we often find change aversive. We often have a hard time envisioning change and don't change unless we're forced to. Change requires effort, and people can be very apathetic and passive about changing or growing or evolving. That is, at the beginning here, in thinking about the evolution of consciousness, even the evolution of humanity, you got to acknowledge that we have this a force within us, a powerful motivational force that is indeed connected with the process of homeostasis to try to preserve stability. But we have a second motivational force, which is toward growth. Throughout history, we have purposefully evolved our physical world through technology. And the world changes on its own, but it also changes due to our intentions to change it. And we've been doing that all along. So we're not entirely stable. We have been changing the world for one thing. But secondly, I would suggest that through history, various people have attempted to purposefully evolve or improve human consciousness. And they are people that we find in religion, spirituality, literature, art, philosophy, psychology. That is, throughout history, people have been coming up with theories. Can you hear me again? Okay, all right. Yes, I don't know why it went out. Okay, we already did that. Did that. Okay, here we were. So when people suggest practices for ethical development, spiritual development, psychological development, philosophical enlightenment and wisdom throughout history, what they were doing, in fact, is proposing ways in which we can evolve our consciousness, our conscious states of mind, whether it's our emotions, our spirituality, our thinking, etc. So consciousness has been evolving through history, often unintentionally, but at least some of the time intentionally. Now, a quote from Darwin: "The highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts." I would suggest, if we look at the flow of our own normal consciousness, to various degrees, we are purposively guiding the evolution of our own individual consciousnesses. That is, we possess the capacity of self-awareness. We can reflect on what we're thinking and feeling. We can evaluate what we're thinking and feeling, and do so a lot. We ask ourselves, am I thinking and feeling the right things, the wrong things? And we can attempt to direct and change, which we do, the flow of our consciousness. That is, personal consciousness evolves and matures through our lifespan, often unintentionally, bitter lessons, but at times intentionally. That is, we see in our own flow of consciousness, not just the process of evolution, but the process of purposeful evolution. So not only do we see it out there in the world through technology and through our own efforts to change the physical world, we can see evolution at work in our own conscious minds. So consciousness evolves both purposefully throughout history and within our individual streams of consciousness. And when the evolution of consciousness is purposeful, we intend to do it involving the efforts of our own consciousness to think different things, to try to direct our states differently, to use imagination, to improve our states of consciousness. Then know what we're doing is that consciousness is trying to evolve itself. That as consciousness is reflecting on its own nature, its own makeup, and attempting to move it in a different direction. So can we evolve consciousness? Yes, indeed we can. We've been doing it all along. We do it all the time. There's multiple theories and practices, and to various degrees, we've been achieving this goal, maybe haphazardly, maybe in very counterproductive ways, but we indeed have been doing it. So should we do it? Yes, of course we should do it, because that's part of our nature, and there would be pervasive positive impacts to evolving our consciousness. Okay, so now we come to the center, the core of this whole talk, which is where it gets challenging. That is, what is consciousness? The centrality and the nature of consciousness. And I've been writing about this for years. In fact, back in the 1970s and 80s, my first published book was on perception and perceptual awareness of the environment, which in my mind at that time was an extremely, and still is extremely fascinating topic. And that was my first book that I ever published, The Reciprocity of Perceiver and Environment. But in World Future Review, I published 2 books on the future of consciousness back in the last decade, The Future Evolution of the Ecology of Mind and The Future Evolution of Consciousness. In the Journal of Cosmology, I published Ecological Cosmology of Consciousness. And in the Journal of Future Studies, I published a book, an article on the singularity and how that fits in with consciousness and cosmic evolution. So these publications, I can send you references for in case you're interested in looking at them. And in fact, all of them except for the book are up online on the Center for Future Consciousness website. So here's what we're trying to do. And I think Escher's image is a good image here. We're trying to reflect on ourselves, look at ourselves. we're trying to be conscious of our own consciousness to try to understand what it is. And of course, that can send one's head dizzy trying to look at ourselves, our own consciousness. But as a start, I would suggest that any sound theory involving the future of consciousness requires an understanding of consciousness. How do we know how it's going to evolve unless we have some understanding of what it is? What is this thing that we have? Well, you find when you look at the history of this and the contemporary reality of it, you find lots of different theories of consciousness, lots of different theories of the relationship of consciousness with the physical world. And people will frequently say, including myself, that consciousness seems to be a great mystery, and how we understand it and how it connects into physical reality. And it gets debated and gets debated and gets debated. But one thing to note here is that consciousness is amazing because we awaken to existence through consciousness. That is, it is consciousness that reveals reality and existence to us. That's amazing, just to begin with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, based on that, just present a theory of normal consciousness. I know there's lots of, to begin with, esoteric and metaphysical ideas about consciousness, but just looking at normal consciousness, to me, turns out to be a challenge and turns out to be very interesting when you do that. And two things about it that I'm going to highlight, one I've already done a bit already, is that consciousness is evolutionary, but the second one is that consciousness, normal consciousness, is ecological. And I'll explain what I mean by that. And I'm not going to mean anything fancy by consciousness here. Consciousness simply means to experience, to be aware. And consciousness, in my mind, is a natural phenomenon. It's part of nature. The puzzle is how it's part of nature, but it seems to definitely be part of nature. It is the core of human reality in that we live our lives within the sphere of our consciousness, and it is the medium in which everything meaningful is manifested and understood. And if one just reflects for a moment at one's own consciousness, one is conscious of the physical world around oneself through perception, one's conscious of one's thoughts, one's emotions, one's theories and ideas. That is, everything that makes any meaningful sense gets manifested to us in consciousness and gets understood in consciousness. Consciousness is at the core of human reality and existence. And the next thing I'm going to note is that normal human consciousness is personalized. That is, you will note in your consciousness that there is a sense of a self or an I. And this sense of a self or an I is a conscious reality. The I, the me, is a conscious reality in one's consciousness. And this self appears to be the source or the agent of consciousness. That is, I am conscious. It is the I that's conscious. But there's an I in there. That is, consciousness normally in humans is personalized. And indeed, one is aware of oneself within consciousness, that it is a normal state of affairs in all of us. At times it is more clear, at times it tends to go more into the background, to be aware of oneself. We are aware of ourselves as conscious beings. Self-consciousness seems to be inextricably part of normal consciousness. And as I said, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less attended to, but it's always there. My awareness of me. So the question is, does depersonalized consciousness exist? And people have proposed that it does, but it seems to me that normal consciousness is personalized. And I've never met any conscious being that didn't seem to be personalized, didn't seem to have a self. And this seems tied to the fact that we have unique individuated bodies located in space and time. And that's what brings me to the second point. We appear to ourselves as embodied. That is, our consciousness appears manifested, existing in this thing I call my physical body. And in fact, if a moment's introspection, it feels as if my body is conscious. In fact, if I grab something and touch it and feel it, it feels like my hand is tactually conscious of the object. Consciousness is felt as in the entire body. The toe feels, the nose smells, the ears hear, the whole body feels conscious. Now, people will say that consciousness is in the brain, but that's not how it appears. It appears that consciousness is bodily. The whole body is conscious. And we appear to ourselves as possessing these physical bodies. So consciousness seems somehow to be connected with this body. So does disembodied consciousness exist? I don't really believe so, but a lot of people do. But embodied consciousness is the normal state of affairs. And our body and indeed our brain seem necessary for it. And I'm not saying that consciousness is just states of the brain, but it doesn't seem to me that there is any such thing as disembodied consciousness. Normal consciousness is not felt as disembodied. And indeed, we appear to ourselves and others appear to us as we appear to them as embodied and personalized conscious beings. That is, consciousness manifests itself in personalized bodies. Right now, I'm looking at Jeannie and Eva, but I got a picture of Terry instead of Terry's actual face. And we appear to each other as conscious persons with bodies. And we interact with each other as conscious persons with bodies. That's our normal mode of existence. I seem conscious to you, you seem conscious to me, and our mode of interaction is vis-a-vis these conscious personal bodies, personalized bodies. So each of us is a conscious being, and humanity is a collection or a collective of interactive conscious beings, because these conscious beings that are us are able to interact and communicate with each other. And next, our conscious embodied selves appear localized and surrounded in a physical environment. We experience our world from a point of view of the location of our body in space and time. That is, when I look out on the world, I see something surrounding me, and the perspective I have of what's surrounding me appears localized to the location I am in that ecological space, that environmental space. That is, I don't see the world from no point of view or every point of view. I see the world as from a point of view, and I see the world as surrounding and engulfing me. I'm in it. And I appear to be conscious of that extended surroundings. I can see objects out there. I can hear things out there. I could smell things out there. That is, it appears that I'm conscious of this external physical world that surrounds me. And all of my knowledge of that physical world comes through consciousness. To begin with, perceptual consciousness, the seeing, hearing, and touching, and smelling, and tasting of the world. And we're conscious both of ourselves as conscious beings, and we're conscious of that ambient environment, surrounding environment, and we're definitely conscious of the relationship between the two. I could see where I am, I could feel where I am, I can see where things are relative to me. And in fact, that's critical. A fundamental feature of consciousness, perceptual consciousness, is that it's ecological. that I experience myself in a world and the two in relationship with each other. So in consciousness, normally there is an I and a surrounding other, and that seems primordial to normal consciousness, the I and the other. And our knowledge, both of ourselves and the world, it's manifested in this ecological consciousness of myself as a being in a world. Now, because we're localized and because we develop concepts and ideas about the world, we always experience and understand the world from a perspective. That is, there is neither omnipresent nor non-interpretive consciousness. Consciousness is always from a point of view, perceptually and conceptually. There's no such thing as pure awareness. It's always framed and it's always perspectival within a mental framework. And so it's inextricably subjective. That's where we're starting from. Consciousness is inextricably subjective. It's from a perceptual point of view and from a conceptual theoretical point of view. But we continually strive toward objectivity. We work at it. We try to take multiple perspectives, multiple points of view. We come up with standards for evaluating our beliefs, our thinking. We look at ways in which we can ascertain how biased we are. We keep working on that. So even though we are in a reality which is inextricably subjective, we are continually trying to become more objective about what we are conscious of and what we think. In fact, consciousness is always doing that. Now, another issue that comes up in the philosophy of consciousness is, in fact, do we perceive the external world, or are we just aware of our brains or states of our brains or our private bubbles in our own consciousness? That is, the belief that consciousness is something absolutely private. Each of us has our own consciousness, and we cannot in any sense get outside of it to apprehend what the real physical world is, or that anybody else has any consciousness besides my own. But I would suggest that that is not how it appears. It appears that we are conscious of an external world. It is created ecologically because it's not just my body that's conscious here, but the world around me reveals itself to me through, and this is an elaborate topic that I could get into at length, it reveals itself to me through the complex patterns of energy, information it broadcasts into its surround. So between that capacity to resonate with what's out there and the world presenting itself in an intricate fashion, in fact, in such an intricate fashion, I can't take it all in, our consciousness seems to be capable of being in contact with or aware of the external physical world. Indeed, we appear to be conscious of other consciousnesses. So if we look each other in the eye, we smile, we say hello, it feels as if my consciousness and your consciousness touch, contact. Consciousness is not absolutely private. Now, I'm bringing these different points up, by the way, because any viable theory of consciousness has to explain and understand this. And at present, it appears to me that our framework for understanding reality cannot grapple with some of these fundamental, obvious points about human reality. So I can know to degrees the other. Of course, I don't know them entirely. Of course, I can't resonate with them entirely, but we do make contact with each other consciously. And in fact, just as bizarre and just as interesting is that when we pick up tools and we use them, it feels as if our consciousness extends into the tools and into the instruments. So when I'm driving in a car, I can feel the road through the tires of the car. if I pick up a stick or a pen, for example, and I rub it across the surface, it feels as if I'm touching the surface in its structure and granularity through the pen. How is that possible? And indeed, as we all know, we learn to think with our computers and pencils and paper. That is, the tool becomes part of our conscious body. That's another interesting facet of consciousness. Now, another thing we're able to do, which is interesting to say the least, is we can transcend the here and the now with human consciousness by and through our capacity for memories of the past, through abstract thought, through imagination, through anticipation, and through goal intention. That is, I can go beyond the immediate here and now because I could think about the there and the then and the hypothetical and the possible and what happened last week and what might happen 100 years from now. And I could imagine all kinds of things that go beyond what I'm directly confronted with perceptually. And that's a very fascinating thing about human consciousness, is that it isn't locked into its present localized reality. It starts there, but it can expand on that. And another thing that is often said, and in fact, indeed is true, is we move the world, the physical world, and manipulate it through our consciousness. Now, this is often treated as being a psychic capacity, telekinesis. I move objects through my mind. But in fact, we move objects through our mind all the time. And we do so by communicating, by inventing, by taking ideas and creating physical instantiations of them. That is, in many, many different ways, we're perpetually manipulating and altering the physical world through our conscious minds. So we understand, we impact, we guide, and make and remake the world through our consciousness. Consciousness has great power. Mind controls matter. And consciousness is very diverse. Now that we get a little more specific here, there's all different dimensions. There's bodily consciousness, there's behavioral, perceptual, emotional, motivational, there's memory, there's thinking, there's imaginative consciousness, the sense of self, there's interpersonal consciousness. So consciousness is multifaceted, but it all integrates together. So I'm feeling, hearing, perceiving, remembering, often all at the same time. And we have this, there's this integrative quality to consciousness. So it feels as if my self is continuing across time and staying relatively stable, not completely, but relatively stable. And it appears as if the environment as a whole is staying relatively stable and integrated. So consciousness has this integrated quality to it of a relatively stable self with a whole slew of different feelings and thoughts going on, which are changing within a relatively integrated surrounding environment, although it may be changing too. So there's a dynamic flow in this relative integration. There is transformation, there's becoming and passing away. That is, for example, I have new thoughts, new feelings, new perceptions moment to moment, and the world around me moment to moment will be changing. So there's a flow, a perceived flow in it, but again, staying integrated while it's flowing. And the flow has a direction to it, which is into the future. It's future directional. Consciousness moves from present into future, the era of time, and it's contextualized in terms of interpretations from the past and anticipations of the future. I would suggest there is no pure conscious present. The present, what we call the present, is always infused with our understanding and learning from the past and our anticipations of what's coming next. you can't get to a pure present because it's a flow and it's an interpretive flow. And this direction is evolutionary because in this flow, we are guiding consciousness, our thoughts and feelings and ourself in purposeful directions. We're trying to control and direct that flow into the future. So that's a natural state of affairs. And I just went into it in a lot more detail than I did a moment before. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, so we find unity and diversity and stability and change in consciousness. And so it's holistic in that it is both ecological of this sense of being in the world and my relationship with the world, and it is evolutionary in that it is in a process of change, often purposefully, and that's a good starting point, plus all the other things I said along the way, toward envisioning how consciousness can and should evolve from based on that fundamental nature to consciousness. Now, as I mentioned when I presented the outline, and this is something we could talk about for 2 hours, I'm sure. You could look at contemporary consciousness, and a way to come at how we could evolve it would be to identify what we would think are the failings and weaknesses of contemporary consciousness. And I try to do this in my little book, The Pursuit of Virtue, and I tried to do this other places too. And this list keeps growing and growing on me. Like, for example, I think that our consciousness is too narrow, that we're too focused on the present and we're too focused on the short term and quick fix mentality and have no expanded sense of past or future or what's out there in the big world as opposed to my narrow little area of focus. That is, in presentism, that's the term I use here, is the condition of consciousness in animals and in infants. When people say focus on the present, what they're really saying there is go back and turn your mind back into the mind of an infant or an animal. And in fact, lots of our ecological environmental problems have to do with the fact that we simply have always focused too much on the present and not enough on future consequences. Another clear weakness that can be addressed with respect to consciousness, can evolve, is that normal collective human consciousness is way too egocentric, too centered on me, and too centered on my own individual self. We're relativistic, we're selfish, we're narcissistic, we lack empathy, we have no trouble at all with injustice and inequality between myself and others. We're non-ecological in our thinking, non-planetary, and clearly non-cosmic. That is, we're very egocentric. So notice the first two have to do with narrow spheres of human consciousness. But we have other flaws that we show. Most recently, we seem to be showing this flaw, although it's been here in history, I'm sure, of being anti-intellectual, anti-thought, anti-rational, and of course, muddle-headed, and being opinionated and delusional. That we see a lot in human consciousness. We engage in a lot of dishonesty and deceit. A lot of us are very authoritarian and closed-minded. We're irresponsible. We tend to see ourselves as victims. We don't feel in control. We suffer from fear and depression, anxiety and stress, apathy and floundering, paranoia and violence. We're addicted, too much so, excessive media immersion. We don't have a clear sense of even who we are. Our attention span is flighty, jumpy, and our conscious minds tend to become mentally fragmented a lot. We prefer solving things through more gadgets, through developing our minds. And we're stuck, a lot of us, in tradition and dogmatism, where we value stability over evolution. Now, that's just my list. And on this list, and items on this list, all of these can be identified as areas that we can improve upon, evolve, and develop as ways to evolve our future consciousness. And addressing these flaws and weaknesses and actually making some dent in them, a big dent in them, would have a tremendous impact on the present practical problems of the day. Our economic, political, technological, environmental problems are to a great degree caused by these various deficiencies and failings in human consciousness. And this is an area we can work on a lot. But now we can come at this the other direction, the positive direction, and say, well, what are the fundamental kinds of consciousness? So instead of thinking of how you evolve just intellectual consciousness, let's think about all of them. Our consciousness of our bodies, that's a big one, perceptual consciousness, emotional consciousness, our memory, our future consciousness, our thinking abilities, our consciousness appreciation of beauty, our moral consciousness, our imagination and creativity, our self-consciousness, our interpersonal consciousness, all these different dimensions of consciousness. One can identify ideals of ways in which we could enhance those different dimensions of our consciousness, becoming more perceptually attentive and sensitive, becoming more in tune with our bodies, pursuing growth and self-evolution as opposed to pursuing the status quo, becoming more self-responsible, developing hope and optimism, cultivating more positive emotionalities instead of fear and depression, but rather love, joy, and gratitude, expanding our temporal and ecological consciousness, the love of knowledge and the love of learning and thinking, developing our creativity. Each of these ideals, which addresses one or more of those fundamental dimensions of human consciousness, there's lots of practices around already, lots of ideas around already as to how to enhance and pursue these ideals of the future evolution of consciousness, both ourselves personally as well as us collectively as a whole. Now, instead of being so analytical, breaking it down, I've identified what I think are some ideal holistic qualities for the future of consciousness. Since our fundamental guiding system in consciousness is our future consciousness, our ability to imagine and direct the future. And so future consciousness, in a sense, is the guidance system of consciousness. I think we should heighten our future consciousness and all of its different aspects. And that's going to be cognitively and emotionally. As an integrative virtue, a good one to shoot for, an ideal integrative virtue, is wisdom, and attempting to live wisdom narratives. That is, instead of attempting to live economic narratives or getting ahead narratives, why don't we try to live a life where we are dedicated to the pursuit and development of wisdom? That's a good holistic ideal. Instead of letting technology and the economics of technology rule us, why don't we aspire toward being wise cyborgs? Because you got to deal with technology, because humans are cyborgs and we live in a technological reality we created. But we should guide our technological creations and use our technological creations toward the pursuit and development of wisdom to become wise cyborgs. We should try to aspire toward a wise society, and we should try to aspire toward a planetary consciousness instead of a fragmented, totally confused, and totally self-centered consciousness among millions, if not billions, of individual competing entities, all of us individually. That is, we have to achieve some kind of planetary cosmic consciousness in us as a general ideal. Now, those are things I've thought about, and I'm sure some of them you've thought about too, as general ideas. But if you want to get really cosmic and far out with respect to the future evolution of consciousness, you could turn to science fiction, and I put up there my 3 books on science fiction, the history of it so far. Now, this image I have up here to begin with, note that we have this really futuristic high-tech city, and we have this woman sitting on the balcony there, looking down on the whole thing. And she looks rather contemplative and meditative in that, what is this all about? Is this something really mesmerizing and bedazzling and wonderful, or is this something to be somber and think about? And maybe that's not the right kind of image we should have for the far future. And I have another one here by the great science fiction artist Michael Whelan to take its place. Standing on a mountaintop looking out at the cosmos and looking out at a galaxy. Now, up here, I have a number of different book covers from science fiction novels, all of them except one, that deal with the future of consciousness in different kinds of ways. And just as a quick rundown, we can have in a science fiction novel the theme of the transcendence of humanity, which we find in novels like Childhood's End and 2001 and Darwin's Radio, where we transcend our present species, which of course would have a big impact on our consciousness. And I think that's a very viable, realistic idea to contemplate. Okay, we can in the future develop mind-to-mind communication, therapy and telepathy through conscious minds, and networks of communal consciousness. And that's a theme that we find in Greg Bear's Queen of Angels and Last and First Men and Star Maker by Olaf Stapleton. We could redesign our bodies and our brains, like in Stapleton's Last and First Men. We can have multiple selves which dive into virtual reality, like in Accelerando. We can communicate and collaborate with other types of consciousnesses, including animals, plants, and aliens. And I mean, we could find ways to enhance our conscious interaction with the living forms on the earth, such as in Startide Rising, where we become collaboratives with dolphins and gorillas and chimps and are able to, at a very deep level, communicate with them. And or we can interact with the consciousnesses of aliens. We can have the direct creation through consciousness telekinesis, such as envisioned in Forbidden Planet, where just by thinking something, I materialize it. We may diversify as a species, such as in Son of Man. We could have symbiotic relations with machines, which may be conscious, such as in Chronicle of the Lensman and the infamous Borg from Star Trek. We may see the emergence of conscious machines or conscious AI, again, from Queen of Angels, but also in the novel Wake. And other possibilities, just to throw them up here out of science fiction, we may download consciousness into machines, our consciousness. We may have virtual minds and virtual realities, such as in Diaspora. We may have distributed consciousness and Gestalt minds, where we have multiple bodies that together in resonance create one consciousness, such as in A Fire Upon the Deep. I put up here one non-science fiction story, Pleasantville, because in Pleasantville, there's a good allegorical presentation of new dimensions of reality opening up in front of us that we presently don't even see. Contacting alien minds could have a big positive impact on our level of consciousness as we broaden our notion of what intelligence might be. Like in Solaris, we make contact with what appears to be an intelligent conscious planet. We could have space minds where we become non-terrestrial and our normal reality exists out in space, not as such as an Hyperion. Oh, and finally, we can develop trans-temporal consciousness, such as envisioned Last and First Men, where our conscious minds travel through time. Now, that last idea, which sounds extremely psychic far out in Olaf Stapleton's Last and First Men, Stapleton at the same time would have agreed, and so would have somebody like H.G. Wells and many other people, that even if we were to develop such amazing future capacities, that it all should be anchored to something like wisdom. That is, technology and conscious powers need to have as a center of gravity some integrative virtues which guide and direct all these powers that we could possibly possess in the future. So, in conclusion and summary, our evolution of consciousness is definitely going to involve a greater and deeper understanding of consciousness and the place of consciousness in our ecological and evolutionary universe. Because in fact, we're still struggling, and I still struggle all the time, with trying to understand what this thing consciousness is and how it fits into the universe. And I think part of our future conscious evolution is going to be understanding this thing of consciousness and how it connects with the universe. And in fact, because consciousness is so fundamental to human reality, and because of the different theories I've seen about consciousness, we're going to probably need to develop a deeper understanding of reality and the universe in the process to even understand what consciousness is and how it fits together with that universe. Theories of consciousness often turn into theories of reality. There's the practical and immediate issue, because our present human consciousness appears very primitive and counterproductive. And this is a thought experiment that I have mentioned to my wife Jeannie at different times, the Martian thought experiment perspective. What if you were an intelligent Martian and you came down to the Earth and had a look at us? How would we appear to an alien mind, a sufficiently intelligent alien mind, standing out and reflecting on us? And we seem like we are having a very big, challenging time getting our act together, figuring out what's important, and productively doing something about it. That is, it looks like we have this, to say family is giving us too much credit, this collective of bickering and fighting and counterproductive beings who can't understand each other, who can't work together, who can't get their environment in working order, and are always at war with each other, et cetera, et cetera. And a big chunk of us get deprived of fundamentals, although we are getting better at that. So from the point of view of a Martian looking at us, it doesn't appear that we're that evolved. I mean, we have lots of really cool things, but how well our minds are in all of this, it just doesn't appear that we are that far along. So the evolution of consciousness can be seen as an inspiring and guiding light for our future. In fact, I would say that consciousness is the light of the cosmos, to use a poetical expression for it. It's that which illuminates the cosmos. The cosmos is illuminated through consciousness. Or one can say we are evolution become conscious of itself. That's what Huxley said, that evolution has become aware of its own dynamic, reflects on itself. And so in that sense, consciousness, and other people have said this one too, human consciousness, which is localized in physical bodies, is the universe knowing itself, becoming aware of itself. So we are the universe reflecting on itself, and that's what consciousness is, if one wants to get cosmic. But of course, that idea has been presented before, but to me, it seems like it has some validity in it, because it's both evolutionary and ecological at the same time. So that brings me to a conclusion on this presentation on the evolution of consciousness. And just one last slide I should mention. And next month, I'll be continuing my science fiction series. The New Culture and the New Wave is the next one in the series, 1965 to 1980. I postponed it a little bit. I'm going to do them on January 8th and the 22nd. So anyway, that ends the talk for today. And thank